My name is Ava, and I am 32 years old. 2 nights ago, I sat in the formal dining room of my parents' estate in Lexington, Massachusetts, staring at a heavily redacted commercial loan agreement. My father, Richard, slid the paperwork across the mahogany table. He did not ask for a favor. He delivered a mandate. He told me I had exactly 48 hours to liquidate my $250,000 investment portfolio to save my older brother, Chase. Chase had run his tech startup into the ground. If I did not drain my savings to bridge his debt, he would lose his company before a private equity firm could acquire it next month. They expected me to panic. They expected me to sign. They forgot that when I turned 18, they gladly paid $300,000 for Chase to attend Wharton, while they handed me a public library card and wished me luck. I took that library card, and I used it to build a career they never bothered to understand. I looked down at the term sheet and saw the name of the private equity firm scheduled to buy my brother out. Apex Capital Partners. A cold silence settled over me. My family thought I was just a low-level data analyst. They had no idea. I am the senior director of due diligence at Apex Capital Partners. They were demanding I drain my bank account to fund a fraud my own team was actively investigating. Before I explain exactly how I dismantled my brother's entire life from the inside out, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. But only do it if you have ever been the scapegoat in your own family. Drop your age and where you are watching from in the comments. I want to know who is listening today. Now let me take you back to that Tuesday evening in Lexington and the moment they handed me the weapon I would use to destroy them. The air in the dining room smelled of expensive, catered salmon and unearned confidence. My mother, Caroline, sat at the head of the table, adjusting her sapphire necklace. She watched me with the gaze of a woman accustomed to immediate obedience. Chase lounged in the chair across from me. He swirled a glass of bourbon, resting his Italian leather loafers against the base of the antique table. He did not look like a man facing financial ruin. He looked like a man who knew his parents would simply purchase his salvation. "The bridge loan is just a formality, Ava," my father said. His tone was brisk and stripped of any parental warmth. "Chase has a $50 million buyout scheduled with Apex Capital. We just need to cover his operating costs for 30 days until the ink dries. We are family. You will wire the funds by Friday." I looked at the redacted document. Thick black marker obscured the lender details and the collateral origins, but the numbers remained visible. $250,000. Every cent I had earned, saved, and compounded over a decade of working 80-hour weeks. I traced the edge of the paper with my index finger. I paid for my own college tuition by working double shifts at a hotel front desk. I studied corporate valuation by reading borrowed textbooks until the library closed at midnight. My parents never asked about my career. To them, I was the invisible daughter who wore sensible suits and lived in a quiet condo, while Chase graced the covers of local business magazines. "Why does Chase not secure a traditional commercial line of credit?" I asked. My voice remained level. Chase scoffed and took a slow sip of his bourbon. "Do not worry your little researcher brain about the mechanics of venture capital, Ava," he said. "The Apex guys are sharks. If they see fresh debt on the balance sheet, it might spook them. Keep it in the family. The buyout is a done deal." He flashed a blinding white smile. It was the smile of a man who believed his own fabricated narrative. He had submitted his financial disclosures to Apex Capital Partners 3 weeks ago. I knew this because those exact disclosures were currently sitting on my secure server. I was the shark he was so desperate to hide from. The ice clinked softly against the crystal of Chase's glass. He lounged in the high-backed dining chair wearing a tailored Italian suit that cost more than my first car. He swirled the amber liquid, watching the light catch the expensive crystal. He projected the flawless, unearned confidence of a man who had never once been allowed to fail. His posture suggested we were discussing a minor administrative error, rather than a catastrophic financial crater threatening his entire existence. To understand the sheer audacity of my brother sitting across from me, demanding $250,000, you have to understand the specific rules governed by my parents. We grew up under the same roof, but we inhabited entirely different realities. My father, Richard, treated his children like corporate assets. Chase was the flagship project. He was the firstborn son, the namesake, the heir apparent to a suburban legacy built on country club memberships and carefully managed appearances. I was the secondary asset. I was expected to require minimal maintenance and yield quiet compliance. When Chase graduated high school, Richard threw a lavish, catered party in the backyard. He handed my brother the keys to a new sedan and proudly announced he was covering the entire cost of a private university. Chase spent the next 4 years attending frat parties, taking ski trips to Aspen, and graduating with a mediocre transcript. Richard then wrote a check for $300,000 to secure my brother a spot in a prestigious MBA program. My father viewed it as an investment in the family brand. 4 years later, I stood in that same foyer, holding my own high school diploma with straight A grades. Richard did not throw a party. He did not buy a car. He pulled me into his home office, sat behind his mahogany desk, and informed me that the education fund was tapped out. He told me the market had fluctuated and Chase had required more capital than anticipated. My father opened his desk drawer, pulled out a plastic public library card, and slid it across the polished wood. He told me I was a smart girl, and he was sure I would figure it out. I did figure it out. I took that plastic card and rode the public transit into the city. I spent thousands of hours in the Boston Public Library. While my brother was networking at Wharton galas, I was sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, reading borrowed textbooks on corporate valuation, financial modeling, and contract law. I worked night shifts at a hotel front desk to pay for a state college degree. I built my foundation brick by brick, studying the architecture of failing businesses and learning how to dismantle them. I developed a lethal reputation in corporate restructuring, precisely because I knew what it felt like to build something from nothing. Meanwhile, Chase built an entire career out of smoke and mirrors. He launched a series of tech logistics startups that relied heavily on aesthetic, branding-catered launch parties and flashy press releases rather than actual, sustainable revenue. Whenever his companies began to hemorrhage cash, Richard quietly stepped in. My father would open his checkbook, bridging the gaps and hiding the failures to protect the golden boy's image. But sitting at the dining table, I knew this time was different. Richard was not offering to write a check. He was demanding mine. Caroline broke the silence. My mother placed her silver fork onto her china plate, the sharp sound echoing in the large room. "You have done very well for yourself, Ava," she said. Her tone was carefully modulated, designed to sound maternal, while delivering a threat. "We always knew you were a saver, but Chase is standing on the edge of a massive breakthrough, $50 million. When the Apex buyout clears, he will pay you back with interest. It is a temporary reallocation of family resources." I kept my hands folded in my lap. I did not look at my mother. My eyes remained fixed on my brother. Chase took another sip of his bourbon and sighed the heavy, theatrical sigh of a visionary being delayed by a subordinate. "Come on, Ava," he said, leaning forward. "Do not overthink this. I know you like to crunch your numbers and read your little spreadsheets, but venture capital operates on a different frequency. You do not need to worry your little researcher brain about the mechanics of the loan. The Apex acquisition is a done deal. I just need you to cover the mundane operating costs while the lawyers finalize the paperwork." His condescension hung in the air, foul and heavy. He genuinely believed I was a glorified bookkeeper, sitting in a gray cubicle, inputting data for middle management. He assumed his proximity to wealth equated to superior intelligence. I looked down at the redacted commercial loan document resting on the table between us. My trained eyes caught the faint impression of a routing number beneath the thick black marker. I recognized the formatting of the paper. It was a mezzanine debt filing, the kind of predatory lending structure desperate founders use when traditional banks refuse to touch them. If Apex Capital is in the final stages of due diligence, they must be reviewing your user acquisition metrics, I said, keeping my voice devoid of any emotion. Private equity firms base their valuation multipliers on active engagement. Have your numbers held steady over the last 2 quarters? Or have you experienced a spike in churn rate? The dining room went dead silent. Richard frowned, his brow furrowing as he tried to parse the terminology. Caroline glanced nervously between her son and her daughter. Chase blinked, his confident smile faltering for a fraction of a second before he recovered his arrogant facade. He let out a short, dismissive laugh. He waved his hand through the air as if swatting away a fly. "My metrics are bulletproof," he scoffed. "We are seeing exponential month-over-month growth. Our user retention is hitting 90% across all premium tiers. The Apex guys are salivating over the data. They have 0 concerns. That is why the term sheet is already drafted." I stared at him, letting the silence stretch. He did not blink. He held my gaze with the practiced ease of a sociopath, accustomed to people believing his lies. He had just looked his younger sister in the eye and fabricated a financial narrative out of thin air. He claimed his user retention was at 90%. He claimed his growth was exponential. He claimed the private equity firm was salivating over his data. What Chase did not know was that I use my maternal grandmother's maiden name in my professional life. He did not know that the ruthless senior director at Apex Capital Partners, who had been emailing his brokers for 3 weeks demanding raw data files, was sitting right across the table from him. He did not know that I had spent the previous afternoon reviewing his server logs. I already knew his retention rate was a dismal 14%. I already knew his user base was artificially inflated by paid bots. I knew he was hemorrhaging cash and facing an imminent payroll default. He had just lied directly to the woman holding the executioner's axe for his pending buyout. I did not call him a liar. A confrontation would give them an opportunity to pivot, to strategize, to change the narrative. A forensic investigator never tips her hand while the suspect is still speaking. I needed to see exactly how deep this rot went, and who else was holding a shovel. I reached across the mahogany table and picked up the redacted loan agreement. I tapped the edges of the paper against the wood, aligning the pages with slow, deliberate precision. "I need 48 hours to consult my brokerage," I said, my voice flat and professional. "A transfer of $250,000 triggers security protocols. I will review the terms and give you my answer on Friday." Richard let out a heavy breath, his shoulders dropping slightly. He interpreted my delay as submission. He believed the quiet, obedient daughter was falling into line exactly as he had engineered. Chase raised his bourbon glass toward me in a mock toast, a smug victor celebrating his perceived dominance. I stood up from the table, pushed my chair in, and walked out of the Lexington estate without saying another word. The drive back to my self-funded condominium in downtown Boston was a masterclass in quiet focus. My family thought they had cornered a naive researcher into funding their luxury lifestyle. They had no idea they had just handed a loaded weapon to a corporate assassin. Tomorrow morning, I would walk into my corner office at Apex Capital Partners, swipe my security badge, and open the virtual data room. The real investigation was about to begin, and I was going to tear my brother's fabricated empire down to the studs. The tires hummed against the asphalt of Route 2 as I drove away from the Lexington estate. The Massachusetts night was dark and crisp. I did not turn on the audio system. I required the pure silence of the car to compartmentalize the sequence of events. My parents believed I was retreating to a modest apartment to mourn the loss of my hard-earned savings. They envisioned me weeping over a bank ledger, terrified of their disappointment. They had no idea I was driving back to a sanctuary they could never afford. I pulled into the private underground garage of my high-rise building in the financial district. I paid cash for my residence 3 years ago. The concierge nodded to me as I walked through the marble lobby. My home is a minimalist space, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Boston Harbor. There is no clutter here. There is no inherited mahogany furniture reeking of suburban pretense. I poured a glass of sparkling water and stood by the glass, watching the city lights ripple across the dark water. The reflection staring back at me was not the obedient daughter Richard and Caroline had tried to construct. It was the executive they had inadvertently forged. When I started my career, I dropped my father's surname. I legally changed my last name to my maternal grandmother's maiden name, Montgomery. My grandmother was a pragmatic woman who worked as a seamstress and saved every penny she earned. She never cared for country clubs or leased luxury vehicles. Carrying her name was my quiet rebellion. It severed my professional identity from the toxic brand my father built. It was also the ultimate tactical advantage. Chase and his sycophantic brokers had zero idea that Ava Montgomery, the ruthless diligence director they had been trying to impress for a month, was actually his invisible younger sister. I went to sleep that night with a profound sense of clarity. I refused to simply walk away from their extortion attempt. I needed to see exactly how deep the rot permeated their lives. The sun rose, casting a sharp glare over the harbor. I dressed in a tailored charcoal suit and walked the 4 blocks to the Apex Capital Partners headquarters. The skyscraper stood as a monument to modern corporate warfare, built of glass, steel, and silent efficiency. I swiped my security badge at the private elevator bank. The digital readout chimed, granting me access to the top floor. I stepped out onto the executive level. The corridor was quiet. I bypassed the espresso machine in the partner lounge. Caffeine is a stimulant for people who need to wake up. I was already wide awake. I walked into my corner office, closed the heavy oak door, and locked it. I sat behind my dual monitors and typed my credentials into the secure terminal. Private equity acquisitions hinge on a digital vault known as a virtual data room. It is a highly restricted server where a target company uploads their most sensitive operational metrics, financial ledgers, and tax returns. The acquiring firm uses this raw data to justify the purchase price. Chase had uploaded his entire fabricated life into my server. I opened his specific file directory. The screen populated with hundreds of documents. I clicked on the communication log first. The emails from his lead broker read like desperate pleas. They addressed me as Ms. Montgomery. They used deferential language, promising to deliver updated user engagement reports and begging for a brief phone call to discuss the term sheet. The juxtaposition was breathtaking. 12 hours ago, my brother sat at a dining table calling me a little researcher and laughing at my questions. Now I was reading emails where his highly paid consultants practically crawled on their knees to secure my approval. I opened the primary revenue spreadsheet Chase had submitted to Apex. I pulled up the mental image of the redacted commercial loan document my father had slid across the dining table. A forensic accountant does not need a photograph. I possess a photographic memory for numerical sequences. The bridge loan Chase handed me listed his quarterly operating burn rate at $400,000. The spreadsheet he provided to my firm listed his burn rate at a mere $80,000. I opened another file detailing his user acquisition logs. At the dinner table, Chase claimed a 90% retention rate. The internal Apex dashboard tracking his actual active software users showed a steep downward trajectory. His real retention hovered near 11%. He was purchasing cheap bot traffic from offshore server farms to simulate organic growth. But a failing business is not a crime. Incompetence is legal. Venture capital is full of failed visionaries who simply burn through cash and file for bankruptcy. I needed to see the architecture of the fraud. I began cross-referencing the origin accounts listed on his capital expenditure report against the mezzanine debt structure Richard had tried to force me to pay. That is when the true scope of the conflict solidified into something terrifying. Chase did not just mismanage a software startup. He actively falsified his accounts receivable to secure previous rounds of seed funding. He created phantom invoices from fake logistics clients and logged them as actual revenue. He submitted these fabricated tax documents to regional banks across Massachusetts to secure commercial credit lines. When a founder transmits falsified financial documents across state lines via email or digital upload to secure capital, it ceases to be a struggling business. It becomes federal wire fraud. My brother was not asking for $250,000 to bridge a gap until a buyout. He was demanding my life savings to pay off a hostile early investor who had likely discovered the phantom invoices and threatened to expose the Ponzi scheme. My parents were complicit in this deception. Richard knew the startup was a hollow shell. My father had orchestrated the redacted loan agreement to silence the creditors before Apex Capital could finalize the audit. They believed that once my firm transferred the $50 million acquisition funds, Chase could quietly pay back the fraudulent loans and walk away a wealthy man. They were using my hard-earned cash as a temporary shield to hide a federal felony from my own employer. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair. The blue light from the dual monitors reflected in the quiet office. I began downloading the fabricated tax returns and the phantom invoices into a secure, encrypted dossier. I was preparing the kill shot. The due diligence report I drafted would not just terminate the $50 million buyout. It would trigger an automatic referral to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I compiled the digital footprints, mapping out the exact routing numbers, linking my brother's fake clients to his operating accounts. Every click of my mouse dismantled another piece of the suburban illusion my family had protected for 3 decades. But the ecosystem my parents built does not wait patiently. They operate on a timeline dictated by panic and entitlement. As I initiated the final data transfer, my mobile phone vibrated against the sleek glass of my desk. A notification flashed on the locked screen. The security concierge from my residential building was messaging me. I had a visitor in the lobby, causing a severe disturbance. The digital readout indicated the visitor was bypassing the front desk and demanding immediate access to my penthouse. The extortion attempt was migrating from the dining room to my front door. The notification on my secure terminal flashed just as I began compiling the final digital footprints against my brother. My residential concierge was typing in frantic bursts. A woman matching my sister-in-law's description was currently terrorizing the marble lobby of my private building. She was bypassing the guest registry, demanding immediate access to the penthouse, and threatening to initiate a scene if the front desk denied her entry. I locked my workstation and stepped away from the monitors. The walk from the Apex Capital Tower to my residence took exactly 7 minutes. I used that brief window of time to transition my mindset from the role of a corporate executioner back to the facade of a submissive, anxious younger sibling. The biting wind off the Boston harbor whipped against my tailored charcoal coat, mirroring the cold calculation settling in my chest. My family was escalating their pressure campaign. They were no longer content to wait for my answer in the formal dining room. They were bringing the extortion directly to my front door. The polished expanse of my residential lobby usually offered a sanctuary of quiet wealth. Chloe shattered that tranquility the moment I walked through the revolving glass doors. She paced near the elevator bank, wearing a pristine beige cashmere trench coat and oversized designer sunglasses. Her sharp stiletto heels clicked frantically against the stone floor. Chloe was a lifestyle influencer. She spent her days curating a digital existence built entirely on the fabricated success of her husband. She married my brother because he promised her a life of unearned luxury, and she spent the last 5 years documenting every ski trip, private dinner, and designer purchase for her thousands of followers. She viewed me as a tedious background character in the grand cinematic production of her life. I was the boring sister who wore sensible trousers and worked long hours to afford a quiet existence. She never bothered to learn my job title. She only cared that my bank accounts held enough liquid capital to save her aesthetic empire. As I approached the elevator bank, she whipped around and marched toward me. She did not offer a greeting. She bypassed basic human decency and went straight for intimidation. She reached into her leather handbag, pulled out a crumpled piece of thick stock paper, and shoved it directly into my chest. "Read it," she demanded. Her voice echoed off the high ceilings, carrying a shrill, panicked pitch. I took the document and unfolded it. It was a pre-litigation notice from a prominent commercial creditor located in Manhattan. The legal language was sharp and unforgiving. It detailed an imminent seizure of assets, citing multiple breached covenants on a high-yield bridge loan. The letter specifically listed my brother's Chestnut Hill mansion as the primary collateral. The creditor was initiating foreclosure protocols by the end of the business week. If you do not wire that $250,000 by Friday, we lose the house. Chloe hissed. She pulled off her sunglasses, revealing eyes rimmed with red. Her panic was genuine, but her sorrow was entirely self-serving. She was not mourning the collapse of her husband's business. She was mourning the impending loss of her social standing. I cannot be seen packing moving boxes, Ava. If my friends find out we are facing foreclosure, my brand is ruined. I will be a laughingstock. You have to fix this. She stood in my lobby, demanding I liquidate a decade of my own labor, so she would not have to face the embarrassment of downsizing. The sheer sociopathic entitlement radiating from her was breathtaking. She expected me to sacrifice my financial security to protect her country club reputation. As she continued to list the various social events she would be forced to cancel, my mobile phone vibrated inside the wool pocket of my coat. It was a social media alert. I maintain an anonymous digital account specifically to monitor the public behavior of corporate executives undergoing due diligence. I pulled the device from my pocket under the guise of checking a work message. A fresh notification sat on my locked screen. Chloe had uploaded a new photograph to her profile exactly 20 minutes ago. She must have posted it while sitting in the driver's seat of her SUV, right before storming into my lobby. The image displayed her wrist resting against the steering wheel of a luxury vehicle. Strapped to her arm was a brand new gold Cartier watch adorned with a halo of diamonds. The caption below the photograph read, "Celebrating the upcoming acquisition with an early gift to myself." The retail value of that specific timepiece was $15,000. The disconnect between her digital reality and her physical begging was a masterpiece of hypocrisy. She was actively weeping about impending homelessness while simultaneously flaunting extreme luxury purchased with stolen funds. They wanted to drain my life savings so they did not have to pause their shopping sprees. They viewed my bank account as a supplemental credit line to fund their delusions. I did not react to the photograph. I let the screen go dark and slipped the phone back into my coat pocket. My index finger traced the edge of the device until I found the external volume button. With a practiced, subtle motion, I activated the voice memo function. The microphone was now recording every sound in the quiet lobby. I forced my shoulders to slump. I widened my eyes and allowed my breathing to turn shallow, mirroring the anxious, subservient sibling they expected me to be. "Chloe, I am terrified," I whispered, keeping my voice soft and hesitant. "I want to help Chase, but this letter is threatening an immediate federal lien. If I transfer my savings, how do I know the bank will not just freeze the wire? How is Chase holding off these aggressive creditors right now? $250,000 is not enough to stop a foreclosure if the underwriters already filed the paperwork." Chloe sneered at my apparent lack of vision. Her desire to feel superior overrode her basic survival instincts. She could not resist the opportunity to boast about her family's cunning strategy. She stepped closer to me, lowering her voice slightly, but speaking clearly enough for the microphone hiding in my pocket to capture every single syllable. "You do not understand how high-level finance works, Ava," she scoffed. "Chase is not stupid. He knew the creditors were getting restless, so Richard handled it. Your father stepped in and drafted some new collateral documents to stall the underwriters." My heart beat a slow, steady rhythm. "What kind of collateral?" I asked, playing the role of the naive sister, desperate for reassurance. "Real estate," Chloe bragged, her chest puffing out with unearned pride. Richard pledged some of his own commercial equity and signed the new guarantee letters himself. He bought us an extra 30 days. "As soon as your firm sends the wire on Friday, Chase pays off the bridge loan, and those new collateral documents disappear before anyone even registers them. You just need to send the cash and stop asking tedious questions." I stared at her, letting her arrogant confession settle into the digital memory of my recording device. She thought she was proving her superiority by revealing a masterful stalling tactic. She was entirely oblivious to the legal reality of her statement. My father did not just facilitate a fraudulent tech startup. He actively drafted fake property deeds and forged signatures to pacify hostile creditors. He created fabricated collateral to secure a delay on a defaulted loan. Richard had crossed the line from a complicit enabler to an active participant in property forgery and bank fraud. "I will have the money ready by the end of the week," I said, my voice trembling with manufactured fear. "Tell Chase I will meet him on Friday." Chloe smiled a cold, triumphant smirk. She adjusted her designer coat and slid her oversized sunglasses back over her eyes. "See," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "Was that so difficult? Family protects family, Ava. Do not make us beg you again." She turned on her stiletto heels and marched out of the revolving glass doors, returning to the luxury SUV she could no longer afford. I stood alone in the marble lobby. The quiet dignity of the space returned. I reached into my pocket and stopped the recording. I saved the audio file under a secure encrypted tag. My brother was running a Ponzi scheme, and my father was forging property deeds to keep the illusion afloat. The family pressure campaign had just handed me a signed confession. I turned away from the elevator bank and walked straight back out into the biting wind. I needed to return to the Apex Capital data room immediately. If Richard forged collateral documents to stall the creditors, those specific property deeds were hiding somewhere in the digital vault, and I was going to find them. The walk back to the Apex Capital Tower felt different this time. The biting harbor wind still whipped at my charcoal coat, but the cold internal calculation had crystallized into a singular objective. I bypassed the security desk with a brief nod and rode the private elevator up to the executive suite. The heavy oak door of my corner office clicked shut behind me, sealing out the ambient noise of the corporate floor. I was back in my sterile, soundproof sanctuary. I removed my coat, draped it over the back of the leather sofa, and sat down at my workstation. My fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing the standard login protocols to access the encrypted virtual data room. I had audio evidence of a forged collateral scheme sitting in my pocket. Now, I needed the paper trail to match. A forensic accountant does not rely on confessions alone. We require the architecture of the crime. I opened the mezzanine debt folder Chase had provided to our underwriters. Mezzanine financing is a specific tier of lending reserved for founders who have exhausted traditional credit lines. It is high yield, high risk, and notoriously unforgiving. The documents inside this folder were buried under layers of complex legal jargon designed to obscure the true nature of the obligations. I began stripping away the corporate veil line by line. The first layer revealed the mechanics of my brother's Ponzi scheme. I cross-referenced his reported operating revenue against the bank statements he submitted for the buyout. Chase claimed his software platform was generating millions in organic subscription fees. The raw server data told a much darker story. He was routing seed capital from his early investors through offshore payment gateways and cycling it back into his own company disguised as fresh user revenue. He paid foreign server farms to generate fake accounts, creating the illusion of exponential growth. When the early investors demanded their quarterly dividends, he simply secured new mezzanine loans to pay them off. He was robbing Peter to pay Paul and using the promise of the $50 million Apex acquisition to keep the entire house of cards from collapsing. But a Ponzi scheme of that magnitude requires a massive influx of collateral to sustain the illusion. Banks do not lend millions of dollars to a tech startup without securing hard assets. Chase owned nothing of real value. His downtown office was leased. His software code was practically worthless. I shifted my focus to the collateral annex attached to the most recent commercial loan. This was the specific debt Chloe had bragged about in the lobby. The lender had issued a pre-litigation threat because they recognized the underlying assets were compromised. I opened the scanned PDF of the guarantee letter. The guarantor listed on the document was not my brother. It was a corporate entity named Horizon Holdings, registered to a post office box in Delaware. Delaware is a notoriously opaque jurisdiction for corporate registry. It is the preferred hiding place for individuals who wish to shield their assets from public scrutiny. But I am not the public. I have access to institutional databases that map beneficial ownership across state lines. I ran the employer identification number for Horizon Holdings through the Federal Clearinghouse. The digital progress bar loaded for 3 seconds before the true owner populated on my screen. The registered agent and sole proprietor of the shell company was Richard, my father. I leaned closer to the monitor, the blue light casting long shadows across my desk. The scale of the betrayal transcended simple favoritism. Richard had not just written a check to cover a missed payroll cycle. He had orchestrated a shadow corporation to secure high-yield commercial loans for his failing son. I pulled the property records attached to Horizon Holdings. The primary asset pledged against the debt was the Lexington estate. I sat back in my ergonomic chair, letting the gravity of that discovery settle into my bones. The Lexington house was not just a piece of real estate. It was my father's entire identity. He purchased that sprawling property decades ago to announce his arrival into high society. He spent his weekends manicuring the lawn, hosting country club mixers, and looking down on anyone who resided outside his exclusive zip code. That house was the monument to his ego. It was the same house where he sat behind a mahogany desk and told 18-year-old Ava that her education fund was empty. He had secretly mortgaged his kingdom to fund a fraud. He pledged the equity of the Lexington estate and leveraged his entire retirement portfolio to artificially inflate the valuation of his Golden Boy's failing tech company. He bet his entire existence on the gamble that Apex Capital would blindly approve the $50 million buyout. The puzzle pieces snapped together with terrifying clarity. The $250,000 they demanded from me was not a bridge loan to cover operating costs. It was a ransom payment. The hostile commercial creditor who sent that pre-litigation notice to Chloe had likely initiated a routine audit on the Horizon Holdings collateral. That auditor discovered the property deeds Richard submitted were forged or improperly encumbered. The creditor realized the Lexington estate was already leveraged to the breaking point. They were threatening to expose the federal wire fraud unless Chase produced an immediate cash payment of $250,000 to satisfy the penalty clauses. If Apex Capital pulled out of the acquisition, the entire structure would instantly vaporize. Chase would face federal indictment for wire fraud and operating a Ponzi scheme. Richard would lose the Lexington estate to foreclosure and face his own criminal charges for property forgery. My parents would be rendered destitute, stripped of their country club status, and thrown into the street. They were trying to use my life savings to pay off a blackmailer who held the keys to their prison cells. They were willing to drain the bank accounts of their invisible daughter to buy themselves another 30 days of freedom. The sheer desperation of their position was intoxicating. They thought they held the power in this dynamic because they assumed I still craved their approval. They did not realize they had handed their financial execution over to the one person who knew exactly how to sever their lifelines. I spent the next 2 hours meticulously organizing the evidence. I saved the Delaware Shell Company traces, the fabricated user metrics, and the forged collateral deeds into a master encrypted file. I titled the dossier Project Icarus. I drafted the preliminary framework of the due diligence kill report. This document would serve as the formal recommendation to the Apex partners to terminate the acquisition. Once signed, it would legally compel our compliance department to forward the findings to the Securities and Exchange Commission. My desktop phone chimed, breaking the intense silence of the office. I ignored it, letting it route to voicemail. 10 seconds later, my personal mobile device vibrated against the wood grain of my desk. A new text message illuminated the screen. It was from Chase. The tone of the message was starkly different from his arrogant posturing at the dining table. It lacked the smooth condescension of the golden boy. It read, "Ava, we need to finalize the transfer details today. I have reserved the main conference room at my downtown office for 3 o'clock. Richard will be here. This meeting is mandatory. Do not be late." I read the words twice. The extortion campaign was migrating again. They were realizing that the Friday deadline was too far away. The creditors were likely closing and pressing them for the hush money. They needed to lock me into a legally binding agreement before I could change my mind. They believed that cornering me in a corporate boardroom, surrounded by glass walls and intimidating posturing, would force me into immediate submission. They were setting a trap in the heart of the financial district. I picked up my phone and typed a single word in response. Understood. I locked my terminal, gathered my leather briefcase, and prepared to walk into the lion's den. I was not walking in as prey. I was walking in carrying the matches to burn their entire empire to the ground. The crisp air of the financial district offered a brief respite as I walked the 4 blocks from my Apex Capital tower to the address Chase had provided. Wednesday afternoon sunlight reflected off the towering glass facades of downtown Boston. My phone had vibrated an hour earlier with a calendar invite from my brother. He marked it mandatory. The digital summons signaled a shift in their strategy. They were discarding the emotional manipulation of the dining room and opting for physical intimidation. Chase leased the entire 12th floor of a renovated warehouse building. It was the architectural embodiment of a modern tech illusion. When the elevator doors opened, I stepped onto polished concrete floors. Exposed brick walls lined the perimeter. Custom neon signs displaying his company logo glowed with an artificial hum. Rows of imported standing desks sat in perfect alignment. There was only one problem. The desks were empty. A company boasting exponential growth and a $50 million valuation should be bustling with engineers, account managers, and sales teams. Instead, the sprawling floor was a ghost town. The silence was deafening. He had spent his seed capital on an aesthetic facade, an expensive stage set designed to impress visiting venture capitalists. It was a hollow shell. I navigated the empty corridors toward the back of the floor, where a large glass-walled conference room overlooked the street. Richard and Chase were already waiting inside. They did not sit. They stood near the head of a long marble table, projecting a unified front of manufactured authority. I opened the heavy glass door and stepped into the room. Chase immediately walked around me and grasped the stainless steel handle. The sharp metallic click of the lock engaging echoed in the quiet space. He locked the door. My brother turned around and crossed his arms, leaning against the glass panel to physically block the exit. This was a calculated tactic. Growing up, Richard often utilized spatial dominance to enforce obedience. Whenever I questioned a rule or requested financial support for a school project, my father would summon me to his study. He would close the heavy oak doors, stand over me, and dictate his terms until I surrendered. He relied on the sheer weight of his presence to crush any resistance. They believed the corporate boardroom would trigger my childhood subservience. They assumed locking me in a confined space with two grown men would activate a primal panic. They expected the invisible daughter to shrink, to lower her eyes, and to beg for their approval. I did not shrink. I maintained my composed exterior, but I allowed my breathing to quicken slightly, playing the role of the cornered prey.
"Sit down, Ava," my father ordered. He did not use the charming country club tone he favored at dinner parties. His voice was gravelly and stripped of the patriarchal mask.
I pulled out a leather chair and sat. Richard reached inside his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a folded document. He tossed it onto the marble table and slid it toward me. I looked down at the paper. The header at the top did not say commercial bridge agreement. It did not mention an interest rate or a repayment schedule. The bold black ink spelled out two words: gift deed. The legal distinction between a loan and a gift deed is profound. A loan implies a contractual obligation to repay the principal amount. A gift deed is an irrevocable transfer of assets. Once signed, the grantor forfeits all rights to the capital. The recipient owes nothing in return. I stared at the phrasing. The commercial creditors holding the forged collateral were clearly tightening the noose. In a standard bankruptcy proceeding, courts can claw back recent loans to satisfy outstanding debts. By demanding a gift deed, my family was attempting to wash my $250,000 clean. They needed untraceable funds to pay off the blackmailer before the federal authorities started freezing their accounts. They wanted my life savings, and they wanted it without a single legal string attached. Chase pushed away from the door and walked to the table. "We are done playing games," he said, resting his palms flat on the marble. "The underwriters need clean capital by Friday. You are going to sign that deed right now and initiate the wire transfer." I looked from the document to my brother. "And if I decline?" I asked, keeping my voice soft and trembling. Richard leaned over the table. He placed his hands on either side of the document, trapping it in front of me. His eyes were cold, devoid of any paternal connection. "If you decline, you will no longer have a career in this city," Richard stated. His delivery was precise. "We know how much you value your pristine little reputation, Ava. We know how hard you worked to secure your position as a data analyst. But Boston finance is a very small circle. It operates on trust and pedigree." He paused, letting the threat hang in the sterile air of the conference room. "If you walk out that door without signing, I will personally contact the compliance department at your firm.
I will inform your superiors that you embezzled $250,000 from the family trust to fund your own investments. I will tell them we discovered the theft, and we are preparing to file a civil suit." The audacity of the threat settled over the room. My father was promising to launch a coordinated smear campaign to destroy my livelihood. He was threatening to accuse me of the exact financial crime he was currently committing. He knew corporate firms despise scandal. A mere allegation of theft from a direct family member would be enough to trigger an internal suspension and a ruined career. They thought they had me in an inescapable bind. They believed my entire self-worth was tied to my modest condo and my steady paycheck. They assumed the terror of losing my job would force me to sign away my savings. They did not know that my firm was Apex Capital Partners. They did not know I was the senior director of due diligence. They did not know that the compliance department they were threatening to call reported directly to me. I looked at the document again. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, memorizing the specific clauses and the stated amounts. By drafting this gift deed and tying it to a verbal threat of professional sabotage, they had just elevated their crime. This was no longer just wire fraud against a commercial bank. This was documented extortion against a federal witness. I needed to solidify the trap. I needed them to believe they had won, so they would lower their defenses and proceed with their Friday timeline. The Friday deadline was the exact moment the Apex kill report was scheduled to detonate. I let a single tear pool in the corner of my eye. I raised my hand and pushed a strand of hair behind my ear, ensuring my hand shook just enough for them to notice. I looked up at my father, wearing the mask of a broken, terrified daughter who had finally realized she could not outsmart her powerful family. Richard watched my face. He saw the manufactured fear and interpreted it as his victory. His rigid posture relaxed slightly. A smug, satisfied smirk crept onto Chase's face. They had broken the scapegoat. I took a ragged breath. I looked my father dead in the eye and spoke in a small, defeated whisper. "Do you have a pen?" Richard smiled. He reached into his breast pocket and produced a heavy silver fountain pen. He held it out to me, the gleaming metal catching the overhead lights. He believed he was handing me the instrument of my own financial ruin. He had no idea he was handing me the tool I needed to execute my final bluff. The silver fountain pen felt dense and cold against my skin. It was an expensive, imported instrument, the kind of writing tool men like my father wielded to finalize country club memberships and sign off on luxury vehicle leases. Richard stood over me, watching my fingers grip the polished metal barrel. Chase leaned his weight against the glass door, his arms crossed, his posture radiating the smug satisfaction of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The silence in the leased downtown office space was thick, heavy with their anticipated victory. I hovered the nib of the pen a fraction of an inch above the crisp, white paper. I stared at the signature line printed at the bottom of the drafted gift deed. I needed to sell this performance with flawless precision. I tightened my grip on the barrel, allowing my knuckles to turn pale. I forced a microscopic tremor into my wrist. The tip of the pen vibrated, hovering dangerously close to the document. A tiny bead of black ink gathered at the point, threatening to mark the page. I drew a shallow, uneven breath, mimicking the physical symptoms of a woman surrendering her last shred of autonomy. My father exhaled a soft breath through his nose, a quiet sound of triumph. He believed the invisible daughter was finally folding under the weight of his corporate authority. He expected me to press the ink into the paper and sign away a decade of my labor to save his golden boy. Then I stopped. I lifted the pen, moving the nib away from the signature line. I set the heavy silver instrument down on the cold marble table.
The metallic clatter echoed sharply across the quiet room. Chase pushed himself off the glass door. "What are you doing?" he snapped. His voice lost its smooth veneer, revealing the frantic desperation simmering just below his curated surface. "Sign the paper, Ava. We do not have time for another one of your hesitations."
I looked up at him, keeping my eyes wide and my posture defensive.
"I cannot sign this document today," I said. My voice remained soft, retaining the manufactured vulnerability they expected. "The capital is not liquid yet." Richard stepped closer to the table, his jaw clenching. He placed both hands flat on the marble, looming over my seated form. "Do not play games with me," he warned. "You told your mother you had $250,000 sitting in an investment portfolio. We know the money is there." "The money is there," I replied, meeting my father's gaze with simulated fear. "But it is held in a Tier 3 brokerage account." I watched their faces as I began to deploy the weaponized vocabulary of federal finance. Growing up, Chase never had to navigate the rigid architecture of banking compliance. He swiped platinum credit cards that Richard quietly paid off at the end of every month. My father dealt exclusively with local branch managers he played golf with, relying on personal relationships to bypass standard protocols. They operated in a suburban bubble of privilege, where wealth functioned as a shield against scrutiny. They were profoundly ignorant of the algorithmic surveillance that governs modern institutional transfers. If I initiate a sudden withdrawal of $250,000, it triggers an automatic Patriot Act review, I explained. My tone was apologetic, the voice of a meticulous rule follower explaining a bureaucratic hurdle. Any outbound transfer exceeding $100,000 requires a mandatory 48-hour security hold. It is a standard anti-money laundering protocol designed to verify the origin of the capital. Chase frowned, running a hand through his styled hair. "So initiate the transfer now and it will clear by Friday," he said, missing the legal trap entirely. "Just sign the deed today so I have the paperwork to show my underwriters." I shook my head slowly, adopting a look of profound concern for his well-being. "I cannot do that, Chase. If I execute an irrevocable gift deed today, while the underlying funds are locked in a federal compliance hold, it creates a chronological discrepancy in the reporting ledger." I let the financial jargon wash over them, watching their arrogance falter against a system they did not understand. "The banking algorithms are designed to flag unverified gift deeds tied to pending six-figure transfers," I continued. "The system flags it as a structured transaction. If I sign this paper right now without the capital clearing the security check, it generates a suspicious activity report. That report is forwarded directly to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network." I paused, ensuring the sterile quiet of the conference room amplified my next sentence. "It will trigger an automatic IRS audit on your receiving accounts before the week is over." The word audit dropped into the room like a live grenade. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. The artificial tan seemed to wash away from my brother's face, leaving him pale and wide-eyed. Chase operated a startup built entirely on phantom revenue, fake user metrics, and forged commercial collateral. An audit was his ultimate nightmare. If federal tax investigators glanced at his ledgers for even 5 minutes, they would uncover the offshore payment gateways and the bot farms. His $50 million buyout would vanish, and he would be trading his tailored Italian suits for a federal prison uniform. Richard swallowed hard. The blustering authority melted from his posture. He stood up straight, taking a slow step back from the marble table. My father had leveraged his beloved Lexington estate through a secret Delaware shell company. A routine tax inquiry into Chase's accounts would inevitably trace the fraudulent loans back to Horizon Holdings. Richard would lose his property, his retirement, and his freedom in a single sweep. The silence stretched, returning to the room, but this time, it was not thick with their victory. It was heavy with their terror. The men who thought they could intimidate me with threats of a local smear campaign were suddenly paralyzed by the specter of the United States government. "Can you expedite the clearance?" Richard asked. His voice was hollow, stripped of its usual commanding boom. I looked down at my hands resting on my lap, playing the dutiful, compliant asset. "I can call my brokerage representative and authorize the release today," I promised. "The anti-money laundering hold will expire by late Friday afternoon. The capital will be fully liquid and ready to wire before the business day closes. I will bring the certified transfer confirmation to the house on Friday evening." Chase looked at Richard, a silent conversation passing between the two conmen. They weighed the risk of pushing me for an immediate signature against the catastrophic threat of federal tax scrutiny. Their greed was powerful, but their self-preservation instinct was stronger. They needed clean, untraceable cash to pay off their blackmailer, and they needed it without alerting the authorities. "Fine," Richard said. He reached across the table and picked up the heavy silver pen, slipping it back into his breast pocket. He snatched the unexecuted gift deed off the marble and folded it away. "Friday evening at the estate. We are hosting a private dinner to celebrate the Apex acquisition. You will arrive at 5 o'clock sharp with the confirmation codes. Do not make a mistake, Ava." I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing the front of my tailored trousers. "I will be there," I said. Chase stepped away from the glass door and turned the stainless steel lock. The metallic click signaled my release. He pulled the heavy door open, refusing to meet my eyes. He was too consumed by the logistical panic of his failing Ponzi scheme to notice the subtle shift in my demeanor. I walked out of the glass-walled conference room and navigated the empty corridors of the fake tech startup. I bypassed the imported standing desks and the glowing neon signs. I pressed the call button for the elevator and watched the digital numbers descend. When the steel doors slid open, I stepped inside and turned around. The doors closed, sealing me inside the descending carriage. I was finally alone. A cold, predatory smile touched my lips, spreading slowly across my face. I had not just bluffed my way out of an extortion attempt. I had not just protected my life savings from two desperate criminals. I had executed a flawless tactical delay. I bought myself exactly 48 hours. I aligned their mandatory Friday evening deadline with the precise moment my internal kill report was scheduled to detonate. At 5 o'clock on Friday, my parents expected me to walk through their front doors carrying the financial salvation of their golden boy. They expected to celebrate a $50 million acquisition with their country club peers. They had no idea that at 4 o'clock on Friday, the partners at Apex Capital would read my due diligence findings. They had no idea that by the time I arrived at their dinner party, the acquisition would be dead and the federal referrals would already be in the hands of the authorities. The trap was fully set, and I was going back to my secure terminal to wire it with explosives. Thursday morning dawned with a pale gray light cutting through the high-rise windows of my condominium. I stood in my minimalist kitchen, grinding fresh espresso beans with mechanical precision. My mind was already leagues ahead, mapping the exact sequence of digital strikes I would execute from my secure terminal. The previous afternoon, in the glass-walled conference room, had been a performance of calculated submission. Today was a masterclass in silent administrative execution. I drank the espresso without pausing to savor the bitter roast. The stakes were too high for leisurely mornings. I dressed in a sharp navy suit and walked the familiar route to the Apex Capital Tower. The biting harbor wind felt invigorating against my skin. I passed the security desk, swiped my badge at the private elevator bank, and ascended to the executive suite. I locked the heavy oak door of my corner office and sat behind my dual monitors. The time for investigation was over. It was time to draft the execution order. In the world of private equity, the due diligence kill report is a document of absolute finality. It is not a negotiation. It is a forensic autopsy of a failing corporate entity designed to protect the acquiring firm from toxic liability. When a senior director submits a kill report, the multi-million-dollar buyout dies instantly. I opened a blank template on my encrypted server and began typing. My fingers moved across the keyboard with cold, clinical focus. I systematically outlined the architecture of my brother's Ponzi scheme. I did not rely on hyperbole or emotional appeals. I used hard data. I attached the internal server logs proving his exponential user growth was entirely fabricated by offshore bot farms. I linked the phantom revenue streams to the seed capital he had illegally recycled from his early investors. I detailed the exact dates and amounts he claimed on his falsified tax returns. But exposing a hollow tech startup was only the first layer of the sabotage. I needed to dismantle the suburban illusion my parents had built to protect their golden boy. I created a separate section in the report titled Collateral Fraud and Undisclosed Liabilities. I uploaded the property records and the routing numbers, tracing directly back to Horizon Holdings, the Delaware shell company. I attached the federal registry documents proving Richard was the sole proprietor. I meticulously detailed how my father had secretly leveraged the equity of his beloved Lexington estate and his retirement portfolio to secure predatory mezzanine debt. I exposed the forged property deeds he used to pacify the hostile commercial creditors who were threatening imminent foreclosure. Apex Capital operates under strict federal regulations. When we uncover significant financial crimes during a routine audit, we are legally obligated to act. If we bury the evidence and quietly walk away, we become complicit in the Friday morning arrived with the sterile brightness of a looming execution. The sky over the Boston harbor was clear and unforgiving. My mobile device vibrated incessantly on the quartz countertop of my kitchen island. 7 text messages from Caroline populated the locked screen within the span of 30 minutes. The tone of her digital dispatches traced a predictable psychological spiral. The first message was a strict demand, confirming my attendance at their evening celebration. The second was a guilt-laden plea regarding the health of her golden boy. The final message was a poorly veiled threat, warning me not to embarrass the family hierarchy. I did not read the paragraphs in their entirety. I did not dismiss the notifications. I simply let the device sit in the silent void of my condominium. Narcissists interpret a response, even a negative one, as a successful engagement. Silence is the only metric they cannot manipulate or monetize. I left my building and walked 2 blocks to a boutique cafe I visit every morning before heading to the Apex Capital Tower. The establishment caters to high-level financial executives, corporate attorneys, and portfolio managers. It is a quiet space, governed by the unspoken rules of professional discretion. The patrons wear tailored wool overcoats and read market analysis on sleek digital tablets. The only sounds in the room are the rhythmic hiss of the commercial espresso machine and the muted clinking of ceramic cups against saucers. It is the last place anyone would choose to stage a theatrical, emotional breakdown. That is precisely why my mother selected it as her battleground. I stood near the polished wood pickup counter, waiting for my standard black coffee. The heavy glass door of the cafe swung open, disrupting the curated atmosphere. The hinges groaned as Caroline stepped inside. She did not wear her usual pristine country club attire. She wore an oversized cashmere wrap and large, dark sunglasses, portraying the visual archetype of a wealthy suburban woman enduring a profound tragedy. She scanned the room with practiced urgency until her eyes locked onto my charcoal suit. She marched toward me, her leather boots striking the floor with arrogant purpose. She bypassed the line of waiting customers, ignoring their irritated glances. She did not lower her voice to offer a standard morning greeting. She projected her words to reach the furthest corners of the cafe. "Ava, how could you do this to us?" she cried out.
Her tone was a masterful blend of manufactured heartbreak and calculated volume. The barista stopped steaming milk, holding a metal pitcher suspended in midair. Two corporate lawyers sitting at a corner table paused their hushed conversation. Every eye in the establishment darted toward the commotion. Caroline knew exactly what she was executing. Growing up, she routinely utilized public settings to enforce obedience. If I disagreed with a curfew or refused to attend a tedious social function, she would reprimand me in front of her friends or our neighbors. She weaponized the audience, knowing my natural inclination was to avoid drawing attention to myself. She assumed the threat of public humiliation in my own professional neighborhood would break my resolve and force me to hand over the $250,000 before the evening deadline. You are letting your own brother face the streets over petty jealousy? Caroline wailed, stepping closer. Her hands trembled as she clutched her designer handbag. Chase has worked so hard to build his software company, and you are sitting on a mountain of hoarded savings, refusing to lift a single finger. Chloe is terrified they will lose their home today. You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter. We gave you everything you needed to succeed, and you are willing to let your family become homeless while you drink premium coffee. Her monologue was a breathtaking tapestry of revisionist history. She stood in a room full of strangers, claiming she and Richard gave me everything I needed to succeed. She conveniently omitted the plastic public library card and the midnight shifts at the hotel front desk. She erased the reality that I built my wealth without a single cent of their capital. I stood perfectly still. I did not flush with embarrassment. I did not scan the room to gauge the judgment of the professionals watching us. I analyzed her performance with the clinical detachment of a forensic auditor reviewing a falsified tax ledger. 10 years ago, this exact scenario would have crushed my spirit. The younger version of myself would have panicked, apologizing frantically and promising to wire the funds immediately just to make the public screaming cease. I would have absorbed the shame to protect her curated image and preserve the fragile illusion of our family unit. Today, I simply reached out and accepted the warm ceramic cup from the stunned barista. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my dark roast. The heat of the liquid provided a grounding contrast to the cold calculation running through my mind. I looked at the woman who spent my entire life prioritizing a fabricated social standing over my fundamental well-being. She was shedding theatrical tears, relying on the sympathy of commuting strangers who had no idea she was actively participating in a federal wire fraud conspiracy. She expected me to shrink. She expected me to beg for her forgiveness to protect my professional reputation. I lowered my coffee cup. I took one step forward, closing the physical distance between us. I invaded her personal space, breaching the invisible boundary she used to command the room. I leaned in close, stopping mere inches from her face. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I dropped my tone into a soft, lethal whisper, ensuring only she could hear the execution order. "Enjoy the Lexington house today, Caroline," I murmured. The words flowed smoothly, devoid of any anger or hesitation. Soak in the architecture. Walk through the manicured gardens. Look closely at the antique furniture you love so much. Because by Monday morning, you will not own it. The transformation was instantaneous. The manufactured tears stopped flowing. The theatrical trembling in her hands vanished. She pulled back and stared at me. The oversized, dark sunglasses could not hide the genuine, unadulterated terror draining the color from her face. Her mouth opened to speak, but her vocal cords failed to produce a sound. Her brain struggled to process the gravity of my statement. She had stormed into the cafe expecting a negotiation or a terrified surrender.
she did not anticipate a prophecy of total financial ruin. She likely did not know the full extent of the forged collateral deeds Richard had submitted to the commercial creditors. But she recognized the cold, undeniable certainty echoing in my voice. The mask of the heartbroken mother dissolved, revealing the terrified accomplice hiding beneath it. I did not stay to watch her decipher the impending catastrophe. I turned away from her shattered performance and walked toward the glass exit. The cafe remained locked in a stunned silence. I stepped out into the brisk morning air, leaving my mother stranded in a room full of people she could no longer impress. She was a ghost, haunting a life she had already lost. The psychological strike had failed spectacularly, handing me the final confirmation that they possessed zero remaining leverage. The morning disruption was over, and the clock began its final countdown. The hands on my watch moved steadily toward the afternoon. At 4 o'clock, the Apex Capital Partners would open the digital kill report, and the federal referrals would transmit to the authorities. At 5 o'clock, Richard and Caroline were hosting their lavish dinner party to celebrate an acquisition that was already clinically dead. They still expected me to arrive at the estate, carrying the financial salvation they desperately required. I was going to attend that party. I was going to walk through their heavy oak doors one last time, but I was not bringing a certified bank check. I was bringing a leather briefcase filled with the forensic evidence of their destruction. The stage was perfectly primed for the final unveiling. The digital clock on my terminal ticked to 4 o'clock. I did not move a single muscle as the numbers shifted on the glowing screen. For 3 years, I had worked my way to the top floor of Apex Capital Partners, prioritizing logic and data over sentiment. The entire foundation of private equity is built on removing emotion from financial transactions. If a founder fabricates a revenue stream, the firm terminates the buyout without remorse. If an executive obscures a liability, the firm pursues immediate litigation. Yet executing this specific kill report carried a weight no previous audit possessed. At 4 o'clock, the automated server script triggered. A notification icon blinked in the upper right corner of my monitor, indicating a successful transmission. My 40-page due diligence dossier had bypassed the internal firewalls and landed simultaneously in the inboxes of the managing partners, the chief compliance officer, and the internal legal counsel. Project Icarus was airborne. The immediate fallout was entirely silent within my corner office, but the institutional machinery across the city roared to life. The $50 million acquisition of Chase's tech logistics company was officially dead. The partners at Apex were reading the undeniable proof of his Ponzi scheme. They were reviewing the server logs exposing his fake user metrics and the offshore payment gateways disguising his recycled seed capital. Simultaneously, the mandatory compliance protocols initiated. The internal legal team was legally obligated to act on my findings. They were compiling the federal referrals and transmitting the unredacted digital files directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission and the White-Collar Crime Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The commercial lenders in Manhattan who were holding Richard's forged property deeds would receive an automated notice from our risk management department. The notice would inform them that Apex Capital had discovered significant collateral fraud during due diligence and was withdrawing all acquisition offers. That specific notice was the death blow. The commercial underwriters would instantly realize their high-yield mezzanine debt was entirely unsecured. They would trigger immediate foreclosure proceedings on the Lexington estate. The guillotine was swinging downward at terminal velocity. I powered down my dual monitors and unplugged my encrypted external hard drive. I packed my belongings into a sleek leather briefcase, ensuring the brass latches clicked shut with a satisfying metallic snap. I stood up and smoothed the lapels of my tailored navy suit. I did not pack $250,000. I did not secure a certified bank check to rescue my brother from his own incompetence. Instead, the interior compartments of my briefcase held freshly printed stacks of sterile blue folders. The folders contained physical copies of the Apex rejection letter, the formal SEC referral the Horizon Holdings shell company traces, and the transcribed audio file of Chloe's confession in my residential lobby. I was carrying the forensic autopsy of my family's manufactured empire. It was exactly 5 o'clock on Friday evening. I walked out of the Apex Tower and descended into the private parking garage. The air was cool and smelled faintly of exhaust and damp concrete. I unlocked my luxury sedan, sliding into the driver's seat. The leather interior was silent, a sanctuary of control before the impending chaos. My mobile phone resting in the center console illuminated the dark cabin. A text message from Richard pulsed on the locked screen. "Everyone is here, Ava. Bring the check straight to my study. Do not mingle until the transfer is complete." I read the words twice, letting the sheer, staggering arrogance wash over me. The tone was identical to the manner he used to speak to household staff or junior employees. He did not ask how my day went. He did not offer a word of gratitude for the life savings he assumed I was about to surrender. He viewed me purely as a mechanism for his own survival. He expected me to slip through the side door, avoid the glamorous guests, and silently deposit $250,000 onto his mahogany desk before fading back into the wallpaper. He was hosting a lavish acquisition celebration dinner at the Lexington estate. My parents had spent the last 3 days orchestrating a massive premature victory lap. They hired premium caterers, ordered vintage champagne, and transformed their sprawling backyard into an elegant venue. They invited their entire network of country club associates, extended family members, and Chloe's superficial circle of lifestyle influencers. They wanted an audience to witness the triumph of their golden boy. They wanted to bask in the glow of a $50 million buyout. They were drinking expensive wine and boasting to their peers, entirely ignorant of the fact that the buyout had vaporized exactly 60 minutes earlier. They believed they had successfully blackmailed their invisible daughter into bridging the gap until the ink dried. They thought they had outsmarted the ruthless private equity sharks and the aggressive commercial creditors. They had no idea that the shark was pulling out of her downtown parking garage right now, heading straight for their front door. I shifted the car into gear and navigated the ramp, merging onto the evening traffic of the Massachusetts Turnpike. The drive to Lexington took exactly 45 minutes. The sunset cast long, dramatic shadows over the highway, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of purple and orange. I drove in complete silence, visualizing the architecture of the sprawling estate I grew up in. I pictured the grand foyer, the sweeping staircase, and the formal dining room where they first demanded my compliance. My parents spent 3 decades curating a flawless suburban facade. They prioritized the perception of wealth over actual integrity. They threw catered parties to mask their plunging credit scores. They bought luxury cars to hide their failing investments. They forged property deeds and committed federal wire fraud simply to maintain their status in a zip code they could no longer afford. They built a kingdom entirely out of paper. I gripped the leather steering wheel, feeling the solid, tangible reality of the life I had built for myself. I did not rely on aesthetic branding or inherited privilege. I relied on data, logic, and relentless discipline. I was the product of a public library card and 1,000 sleepless nights studying corporate law. I was the exact weapon they never anticipated. As I exited the highway and drove down the winding, tree-lined streets of their exclusive neighborhood, the physical manifestations of their impending ruin began to appear. I passed the manicured lawns and the wrought iron gates of the neighboring properties. These were the people my parents were so desperate to impress. These were the people who would soon read their names in a federal indictment. I pulled onto their street and saw the overflow of luxury vehicles lining the curb. The circular driveway was already packed with expensive sedans and pristine sports utility vehicles belonging to their elite guests. The soft glow of string lights illuminated the backyard, and the faint, melodic hum of a live jazz quartet drifted over the tall privacy hedges. They were throwing a party for a corpse. I parked my sedan near the end of the street, ensuring my vehicle was not blocked by any departing guests. I stepped out onto the pavement, the crisp evening air hitting my face. I reached into the passenger seat and lifted my heavy leather briefcase. The weight of the physical evidence anchored me. I walked toward the estate, my heels clicking a steady rhythm against the asphalt. I bypassed the side entrance leading to my father's study. I was not going to sneak through the service corridor. I was not going to quietly hand over my surrender. I was walking straight up the bluestone pathway leading directly to the grand front doors. The climax of their extortion was perfectly primed, and the guest list was fully assembled. It was time to deliver the final presentation. The circular driveway of the Lexington estate was a parking lot of rolling status symbols. I guided my vehicle between a row of pristine European sports utility vehicles and imported luxury sedans. My car was sleek and functional, purchased with earned capital, but it was dwarfed by the sheer volume of leased automotive ego crowding the pavement. The crisp evening air carried the melodic notes of a live jazz quartet playing in the sprawling backyard. Amber light spilled from the floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the manicured lawn in a warm, inviting glow. It was the visual definition of established suburban wealth. It was also a crime scene waiting for a federal perimeter. I walked up the wide bluestone pathway, taking measured, deliberate steps. Growing up, this house functioned as a theater rather than a home. Whenever Richard lost a significant client or made a disastrous trade in the stock market, Caroline would immediately organize a lavish catered event. They used imported caviar and vintage champagne to blind their peers to their plunging credit scores. Tonight was the grand finale of that lifelong performance. They were throwing a massive party to prematurely celebrate a $50 million acquisition that I had already killed an hour earlier. I reached the heavy oak front doors and pushed them open. I did not ring the bell. I did not wait for the hired staff to grant me entry. I stepped across the threshold into the grand foyer. The interior was a symphony of orchestrated excess. Waiters in crisp white shirts circulated with silver trays of elaborate hors d'oeuvres. Crystal flutes clinked in rhythmic succession. The air smelled of expensive floral arrangements and roasted tenderloin. Chloe had invited her entire circle of lifestyle influencers. They stood near the sweeping staircase, adjusting their designer gowns and capturing digital photographs to broadcast their proximity to perceived wealth. I stood near the entryway, holding my leather briefcase, watching the architects of my misery bask in their fabricated glory. Through the arched doorway leading into the formal living room, I located the guest of honor. Chase stood positioned perfectly beneath the ornate marble fireplace. He held a glass of dark liquor in one hand, while using the other to gesture animatedly. A small circle of minor angel investors and wealthy country club peers hung on his every word. Chase wore a bespoke, tailored tuxedo that radiated unearned confidence. He was delivering a practiced monologue. I could hear snippets of his pitch drifting over the ambient noise. He bragged about navigating the complex labyrinth of venture capital. He boasted about outsmarting the Wall Street sharks to secure his buyout. He painted himself as a visionary disruptor who forced a monolithic private equity firm to meet his relentless demands. The irony of his speech was staggering. He was a man who spent his 20s squandering a $300,000 MBA on failed ventures, relying on his father's secret checkbook to hide his systemic incompetence. Now, he stood in front of an admiring crowd, taking credit for a corporate victory, while simultaneously expecting his younger sister to fund a $250,000 ransom to keep him out of prison. My presence in the doorway did not go unnoticed for long. Richard possessed a predatory awareness of his surroundings, constantly scanning the room to ensure the choreography of his event remained flawless. He stood near the Mahogany wet bar, holding court with the local branch manager, who likely approved his original mortgage decades ago. My father glanced toward the foyer, and our eyes locked. The transformation was immediate. The charming, affable host evaporated, leaving behind the rigid posture of a desperate extortionist. His gaze dropped instantly from my face to my hands. He was searching for a pristine white envelope. He was looking for the certified bank check that would pay off his blackmailer, satisfy the hostile commercial creditors, and wash his forged collateral deeds clean. He saw nothing but the leather briefcase gripped in my right hand. Richard excused himself from the bank manager with a curt nod and marched across the hardwood floor. He did not offer a welcoming smile. He did not greet the daughter he had not spoken to since threatening her career in a downtown boardroom. He closed the distance between us, moving with hostile velocity. He reached out and grabbed my upper arm, his fingers digging into the fabric of my navy suit jacket. His grip was tight, designed to inflict just enough discomfort to trigger silent submission. He attempted to pull me away from the crowd, steering me toward the secluded hallway leading to his private study. "Do you have it?" he hissed. His voice was a harsh, abrasive whisper, cutting through the smooth jazz notes. "Did you bring the transfer confirmation?" He expected me to lower my head and follow him into the shadows. He assumed I would quietly deposit my life savings onto his desk, allowing him to return to his party as a triumphant patriarch. He relied on the psychological conditioning of my childhood, anticipating that I would prioritize the preservation of his public image over my own dignity. I did not let him drag me into the corridor. I planted my heels firmly into the floor, anchoring my weight. I twisted my shoulder sharply, breaking his physical hold. The sudden, violent motion disrupted the curated elegance of the room. A woman standing nearby, wearing a diamond tennis bracelet, stopped laughing mid-sentence. The clinking of crystal glasses in our immediate vicinity ceased. The ambient noise of the party began to dial down, tracing the ripples of tension radiating from our confrontation. The guests recognized the sudden, intense shift in their host's demeanor. I smoothed the sleeve of my suit jacket, recovering my rigid, untouched posture. I did not lower my gaze. I looked past my father and directed my attention toward the center of the living room where Chase was still holding his glass of liquor. The crowd parted slightly, sensing the impending collision and creating a clear line of sight between the scapegoat and the golden boy. "I brought exactly what Chase earned," I announced. I did not shout, but I projected my voice with the clear, unwavering authority of a corporate executive delivering a final verdict. The sentence carried effortlessly over the remaining soft jazz playing in the background. The music seemed to fade into a hollow echo as dozens of wealthy socialites turned their heads to watch the exchange. The influencers stopped taking photographs. The angel investors lowered their drinks. The entire party ground to a halt, fixated on the disruption. I bypassed Richard, leaving him standing frozen and empty-handed in the foyer. I walked toward the center of the living room, navigating the sea of designer gowns and tailored suits. I reached the large, glass-topped coffee table, positioned directly in front of the marble fireplace. Chase stared at me, his arrogant smile faltering as confusion clouded his features. I placed my leather briefcase onto the smooth, transparent surface. I rested my thumbs against the dual brass latches. The climax of their lifelong extortion was perfectly primed, and the audience was watching closely. I pressed down on the metal mechanisms. The sharp, metallic snaps echoed like gunshots in the silent room. The dual brass latches of my leather briefcase snapped open with a sharp, percussive sound that cut through the stifling air of the formal living room. The noise was definitive and clinical. The last lingering murmurs from the country club guests died instantly. The jazz quartet playing on the back patio seemed to fade into a hollow, distant echo. Every eye in the sprawling space turned toward the glass-topped coffee table. The wealthy socialites, the angel investors, and Chloe's influencer circle watched in breathless anticipation as the invisible daughter seized control of the narrative. I did not rush. I lifted the lid of the briefcase with deliberate, slow precision. Inside, resting perfectly aligned, were thick stacks of sterile, professional blue folders. The heavy cardstock covers bore the unmistakable embossed silver logo of Apex Capital Partners. I reached in and withdrew the top folder. The weight of the document felt solid in my hand, an accumulation of forensic evidence and federal mandates. I stepped around the coffee table and extended my arm, offering the file directly to Chase. He stood frozen beneath the ornate marble fireplace, his glass of dark liquor suspended mid-air. His face contorted in a mix of irritation and profound confusion. He recognized the logo of the private equity firm scheduled to purchase his fabricated tech startup, but his brain could not reconcile why his younger sister was hand-delivering corporate documents at a cocktail party. He reached out slowly and took the folder, his fingers brushing against the embossed silver lettering. He assumed it was a finalized term sheet or a celebratory contract. He believed the extortion had worked, and I was presenting the final bridge loan paperwork to secure his $50 million buyout. "Open it," I commanded. My voice was stripped of any emotional inflection, adopting the flat, authoritative tone of an executive delivering a termination notice. Chase lowered his drink, placing the crystal glass onto the mantel. He flipped the heavy blue cover of the dossier. I watched his eyes track the first page. The header was not a congratulatory preamble. It was a stark, uncompromising legal declaration printed in bold red ink. Acquisition terminated. Fraudulent disclosures. The transformation was instantaneous. The artificial tan seemed to bleach from his skin. His jaw went slack, and his chest hitched as his lungs forgot how to draw breath. The arrogant bravado he had weaponized for decades evaporated, leaving behind the terrified posture of a man staring directly into a federal prison cell. His hands began to tremble so violently, the pages of the folder rattled against each other. He stared at the forensic autopsy of his Ponzi scheme, unable to form a coherent sentence. "What is this?" Richard bellowed, shattering the tense silence. My father surged forward from the foyer, crossing the living room with heavy, aggressive strides. He did not wait for his son to answer. He snatched the blue folder out of Chase's trembling hands. Richard's eyes scanned the bold red header and the subsequent paragraphs detailing the offshore payment gateways and the fabricated user metrics. The patriarchal mask he wore to intimidate his family dissolved, completely replaced by the hollow, frantic terror of a trapped con man. "That is the official due diligence report from Apex Capital Partners," I stated. I did not speak exclusively to my father. I turned my body, pivoting slightly, to address the entire crowd of elite guests crowding the room. My voice carried clearly across the silent audience, ensuring every investor and socialite heard the precise nature of the crime. The firm discovered that Chase's software platform is a hollow shell. I continued projecting the facts with lethal clarity. His user engagement metrics are entirely fabricated by offshore bot farms. His operational revenue is a Ponzi scheme built on recycling fraudulent commercial loans from his early investors. Apex Capital is legally terminating the acquisition, effective immediately. A collective, horrified intake of breath swept through the living room. Chloe, who was standing near the sweeping staircase, clutching her $15,000 Cartier watch, let out a dramatic, shrill gasp. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide, with the sudden realization that her aesthetic empire was collapsing in real time. The minor angel investors who had been hanging on Chase's every word moments ago physically stepped backward, distancing themselves from the epicenter of the fraud. They knew the regulatory contagion associated with a terminated private equity deal. They were silently calculating their own exposure to the radioactive fallout. Chase finally found his voice, but it lacked any trace of the smooth, confident founder he pretended to be. His vocal cords tightened, producing a panicked, stammering pitch. He pointed a shaking finger at the blue folder, his eyes darting frantically around the room as his peers witnessed his absolute humiliation. How did you get that he demanded? His chest heaved as panic consumed his logic. How did you get classified Apex documents, Ava? You are just a data analyst. You do not have security clearance for a $50 million buyout. Did you hack their servers? He was grasping at straws, desperately trying to construct a narrative where I was the criminal, where I had stolen the paperwork to sabotage his success out of petty sibling jealousy. He wanted the audience to believe the invisible daughter had committed corporate espionage. He still could not comprehend the magnitude of his own miscalculation. I looked him dead in the eye, holding his terrified gaze. I let the silence stretch for 3 agonizing seconds, ensuring the wealthy guests hung on the impending revelation. I did not raise my voice. I lowered it, forcing them to lean in to hear the execution order. I did not hack their servers, Chase, I replied, my tone dripping with cold, devastating finality. I wrote the report. Chase blinked his mind, short-circuiting against the impossible statement. Because I am the Senior Director of Due Diligence at Apex Capital Partners, I announced delivering the kill shot with flawless precision. I am the executive who spent the last 3 weeks auditing your company. I am the one who traced your phantom revenue to the Delaware shell accounts, and I am the one who legally killed your deal an hour ago. The silence that followed was suffocating. It was not the polite quiet of a country club gathering. It was the paralyzed shock of a crowd witnessing a public execution. The guests stared at me, registering the bespoke navy suit, the rigid posture, and the absolute unassailable authority radiating from the woman they had dismissed as a background character for years. Chase stumbled backward, his Italian loafers slipping slightly against the polished hardwood floor. He hit the edge of the marble fireplace, knocking his glass of liquor over. The crystal shattered against the stone hearth, dark liquid pooling on the pristine white rug. He did not even flinch at the sound. He was entirely consumed by the realization that his sister, the woman he mocked as a little researcher, was the apex predator who had just swallowed him whole. But exposing his fabricated startup was only the first layer of the destruction. I needed to unveil the architect of the extortion. I needed the audience to understand exactly how far my father was willing to go to protect his golden boy. I reached back into my leather briefcase and pulled out a second, thicker blue folder. The real devastation was about to begin, and it involved a Delaware shell company and forged property deeds that would leave Richard with absolutely nothing. The living room descended into a suffocating paralysis. It was the kind of profound stillness that only follows a catastrophic revelation.
The upbeat tempo of the live jazz band playing on the outdoor patio drifted through the open French doors, creating a jarring soundtrack to the indoor devastation. Dozens of elite guests stood frozen in their designer evening wear. They had arrived expecting to drink vintage champagne and network with a newly minted tech millionaire. Instead, they found themselves trapped in the epicenter of a corporate execution. They watched the golden family facade crumble in real time, the curated illusion of wealth disintegrating right before their eyes.
But I was not finished. Terminating my brother's fraudulent buyout was merely the opening act. The true architect of this suburban extortion still believed he could salvage his reputation. I turned my clinical focus away from my hyperventilating brother and locked eyes with my father. Richard stood near the Mahogany wet bar, gripping the first blue folder so hard his knuckles stretched white against his skin. His jaw was rigid, his breathing shallow and rapid. He looked like a pilot, watching his altitude gauge plummet toward zero. He was desperately calculating a way to spin the narrative to convince his country club peers that this was a misunderstanding or a clerical error. He was entirely unprepared for the secondary payload. "And it gets worse for you, Richard," I announced. I reached back into the open compartment of my leather briefcase. The brass latches rested cold against the backs of my wrists. I withdrew a second stack of documents. These files were not bound in standard folders. They were thick legal dossiers, clipped together and stamped with official state registry seals. They carried the undeniable weight of physical evidence. I held the papers up, ensuring the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers caught the stark black ink of the headers. "These are the financial trace documents detailing the ownership structure of Horizon Holdings," I stated, projecting my voice to reach the wealthy socialites hovering near the foyer. "It is a shell company registered to a post office box in Delaware. Delaware is a convenient jurisdiction for individuals attempting to obscure their assets from public record. But institutional auditors do not rely on public records." Richard stepped forward, his polished Italian loafers scraping against the hardwood floor. His mouth opened, but his vocal cords failed to produce a single syllable. The mention of his secret corporate entity drained the remaining defiance from his posture. I traced the registered agent and the routing numbers attached to that specific shell company. I continued, holding my father's gaze. "The sole proprietor of Horizon Holdings is you, Richard." A low murmur rippled through the crowd. The local bank manager, who had been chatting with my father just minutes prior, took a distinct physical step backward. He recognized the legal implications of a hidden offshore or out-of-state entity tied to a client. He was already calculating his own institutional exposure. I turned slightly to address the wider audience, ensuring every investor and influencer understood the mechanics of the crime. To artificially inflate Chase's company valuation and secure the $50 million Apex buyout, Richard secretly leveraged his own assets, I explained. He pledged the equity of this exact property. He drained his entire retirement portfolio. He used his Delaware shell company to guarantee fraudulent commercial bridge loans to keep his son's Ponzi scheme afloat. When the commercial underwriters grew suspicious and threatened to call the debt, Richard forged new property deeds to stall the foreclosure. The silence in the room morphed into something toxic and heavy. The guests looked around the sprawling living room. They looked at the imported Persian rugs, the ornate marble fireplace, and the sweeping staircase. They realized the magnificent Lexington estate they were currently standing in no longer belonged to the family hosting them. It was a compromised asset tied to a massive federal fraud. I turned my attention back to my father, delivering the precise timeline of his ruin. "The Apex acquisition is officially terminated," I said, my tone flat and uncompromising. "The due diligence report was distributed to our internal legal counsel an hour ago. The mandatory compliance protocols have already triggered. I let the weight of that statement settle over him. When the Securities and Exchange Commission and the commercial creditors open their respective files on Monday morning, they will initiate an immediate asset freeze, I warned. They will lock every bank account associated with your name and Chase's name. The commercial lenders will seize this house to cover the defaulted mezzanine debt. You will not have access to a single cent. Richard staggered backward, his shoulders hitting the edge of the mahogany wet bar. The crystal decanters rattled behind him. The patriarch, who had spent his entire life dominating his family through financial intimidation, was suddenly confronted with his own imminent poverty. He had gambled his kingdom on a hollow tech startup, and the house always wins. I looked at my brother and my father, summarizing the true nature of their elegant gathering. You did not invite me here tonight to celebrate, I stated, my voice echoing in the vast space. You invited me here to extort my life savings. You organized this entire party to corner me into signing over $250,000. You needed clean, untraceable cash to pay off a hostile creditor who discovered your forged documents. You tried to rob your own daughter to cover up a federal crime. To my left, a sudden rustle of fabric and a sharp intake of breath diverted the crowd's attention. Caroline, who had been standing near the velvet sofa, watching her social empire evaporate, finally succumbed to the reality of the situation. Her legs gave out. She collapsed onto the plush velvet cushions, her designer evening gown crumpling around her. She raised both hands to cover her face, a gesture of profound, inescapable shame. For 3 decades, my mother had prioritized the perception of elite status above all else. She judged her neighbors, she flaunted her purchases, and she treated her children as aesthetic accessories. Now her country club peers were watching her husband and her son being exposed as desperate felons. The public humiliation she had attempted to inflict upon me in the coffee shop that morning had rebounded with catastrophic force. She was ruined, and she knew her superficial friends would never speak to her again. The reaction from the wealthy guests was immediate and governed entirely by self-preservation. People who inhabit the upper echelons of corporate finance and high society possess a primal aversion to federal investigations. They fear subpoenas, they fear audits, and they fear guilt by association. The exodus began with quiet, frantic precision. A prominent real estate developer set his full glass of vintage champagne down on a nearby side table, leaving a condensation ring on the polished wood. He did not say goodbye to his hosts. He simply turned and walked briskly toward the grand foyer. Chloe's influencer friends lowered their smartphones, deleting the photographs they had taken earlier in the evening. They gathered their expensive clutches and edged toward the heavy oak doors, their stiletto heels clicking in a hurried retreat. The minor angel investors exchanged panicked glances before following suit, desperate to exit the property before any authorities arrived. The party was dissolving into a silent, panicked evacuation. The caterers, realizing the event was effectively over, stopped circulating the silver trays of hors d'oeuvres and retreated toward the kitchen. The grand Lexington estate was emptying out, leaving the architects of the fraud stranded in the center of their own wreckage. But the unveiling of their crimes triggered a secondary reaction. Richard was paralyzed by the legal ramifications, and Caroline was immobilized by the social destruction. Chase, however, operated on a different emotional frequency. My brother watched his investors flee his house. He looked at the shattered crystal glass on the white rug. He realized his startup was dead. His $50 million buyout was gone, and his impending freedom was evaporating. The panic that had initially drained the color from his face mutated into something dark and volatile. He was a man who had never been denied a single desire in his entire subsidized existence. Now the sister he viewed as a subservient secondary asset had stripped him of everything. The realization fractured his remaining logic. He stopped looking at the blue folders and locked his eyes on me. His posture shifted from terrified submission to the coiled tension of a cornered animal. The emotional manipulation and the corporate extortion had failed. He was out of options, and his desperation was about to escalate into physical violence. Chase watched the backs of his fleeing investors with a hollow, vacant stare. His $50 million buyout evaporated into the crisp evening air. For a man who had never faced a single tangible consequence, the sudden arrival of total ruin was an alien and suffocating sensation. His brain bypassed whatever meager corporate logic he possessed and defaulted to a primal, unrefined instinct. He was accustomed to throwing Richard's money at problems. When the money vanished and his carefully curated tech founder persona dissolved, only raw, volatile desperation remained. He pushed off the marble fireplace mantel with a sudden, violent burst of energy. His bespoke tuxedo jacket strained against his shoulders as he launched his body across the transparent expanse of the glass coffee table. His right arm pulled back, his hand raising high into the air, attempting to strike. He expected the younger sister to cower. He anticipated the familiar flinch, the protective raising of arms that he and my father had conditioned into me during our youth. Whenever I challenged their narrative in the past, they utilized spatial dominance and physical posturing to force my retreat. He thought the sheer size of his presence would override my intellect and terrorize me into withdrawing the federal reports. I did not flinch a single millimeter. I did not shift my weight backward or break eye contact. A woman who spent her early 20s navigating the cutthroat, male-dominated tiers of corporate restructuring does not cower before a subsidized fraud. I had dismantled hostile takeovers and stared down actual corporate raiders who possessed genuine power. My brother was nothing more than a panicked man wearing an expensive suit he could no longer afford. I raised my right hand, moving with fluid, deliberate speed. My fingers gripped my cell phone, holding the device squarely between us. The digital screen glowed brightly, illuminating the harsh angles of his panicked face in the dimming light of the living room. The local police and the white-collar crime division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation already possessed the digital transfer logs I stated. My voice cut through his escalating tantrum like a surgical scalpel. They also have the unredacted audio file of your wife confessing to property forgery in my residential lobby. Every financial trace document inside this briefcase is currently sitting on a secure federal server. I took half a step forward, closing the microscopic gap between his raised fist and my steady posture. I looked up into his wide, terrified eyes. "Touch me, Chase," I whispered the delivery, laced with lethal precision. "Strike me right now, and you will be wearing steel handcuffs before the catering staff finishes packing up the rented silverware." The sentence acted as an impenetrable physical barrier. Chase halted mid-lunge, his center of gravity stalling over the glass table. His raised hand hovered in the space between us, trembling with impotent fury and sudden, paralyzing fear. The reality of the institutional machinery I had unleashed upon him finally pierced his delusion. The threat of physical violence is useless against a target who holds the remote detonator to your entire existence. He slowly lowered his arm, his shoulders slumping under the crushing weight of his newly minted reality. He stepped back from the coffee table, retreating toward the fireplace. He was utterly castrated by the legal architecture he had tried so arrogantly to outsmart. The golden boy, who networked his way through a $300,000 MBA, realized his degree offered zero protection against a federal indictment. The soundtrack of their social demise played out in the background. The heavy oak front doors stood wide open, framing the frantic exodus of their elite peers. The rhythmic crunch of tires spinning against the gravel driveway echoed through the grand foyer. Engines revved as high-end European imports peeled out onto the street, their drivers desperate to put physical distance between themselves and a designated federal target. Inside, the curated ambiance lay in ruins. Half-empty crystal flutes rested abandoned on antique side tables, the bubbles popping silently in the warm air. The live jazz quartet had quietly packed their brass instruments and slipped out the side gate, recognizing that the hosting family was no longer in a position to pay their invoice. The sprawling Lexington estate, designed to project unassailable superiority, was transforming into a hollow, silent tomb. I looked down at the glass coffee table. I gathered the remaining blue folders, aligning the edges with meticulous care. I placed them back into the compartmentalized slots of my leather briefcase. I closed the lid. The sharp metallic snaps of the brass latches engaging echoed in the vast room, finalizing the transaction. I lifted my gaze to the architects of this disaster.
Caroline remained crumpled on the velvet sofa. She buried her face in her hands, weeping for a social standing she would never recover. She mourned her country club memberships and her influencer circle, recognizing that she was now a pariah in her own zip code. Richard stood anchored near the Mahogany wet bar, his posture defeated. His eyes stared blankly at the shattered crystal and the dark liquor pooling on the pristine white rug. The patriarch, who forged property deeds to maintain an illusion of dominance, was confronted with the tangible wreckage of his decisions. They were surrounded by the opulent remnants of their manufactured empire, completely isolated and abandoned by the friends they bought with stolen equity. I picked up my briefcase, gripping the sturdy leather handle. I looked at the two people who brought me into this world and then systematically tried to erase my worth to fund my brother's aesthetic lifestyle. "You told me the education fund was empty," I said. My voice was soft, devoid of malice or theatrical triumph. It carried only the quiet finality of a settled ledger. "You handed me a piece of plastic. You gave me a public library card and told me to figure it out." Richard slowly raised his head. His eyes met mine for the final time. He saw the polished corporate executive standing in his ruined living room, and he finally understood the magnitude of his fatal miscalculation. He starved the only asset capable of sustaining his legacy and overfed the liability that destroyed it. "I figured it out," I whispered. I turned my back on the wreckage. I walked across the imported Persian rug, navigating the discarded champagne glasses and the silence of the defeated men behind me. I stepped through the grand foyer, crossing the threshold of the open front doors. I walked out into the cool, crisp night air. I did not look back at the illuminated windows or the manicured lawn. I walked down the bluestone path toward my vehicle, leaving them alone to suffocate in the silence they had built. The emotional extortion was over. The trap had sprung flawlessly. But the institutional fallout I engineered was just beginning to gather momentum, and the coming weeks would deliver a swift, unforgiving reckoning to everyone left inside that house. The aftermath unfolded over the next 3 weeks with the swift, uncompromising precision of a biblical plague. The sequence of events played out exactly as the algorithms and compliance mandates in my due diligence report predicted. Institutional finance operates without sympathy. When a corporate entity breaches federal trust, the response is a mechanized execution. My family spent decades believing their suburban charm and golf course handshakes could shield them from consequence. They discovered very quickly that charm carries zero currency in a federal courtroom. By Tuesday morning, the ghost town of a tech startup my brother leased in the financial district was no longer empty.
The sprawling floor, with its exposed brick and custom neon signs, finally saw some foot traffic. It did not come from angel investors or eager software engineers. The visitors wore dark windbreakers bearing the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They bypassed the polished reception desk and executed a coordinated raid. Agents seized the servers, confiscated the hard drives, and boxed up the digital ledgers that contained the architecture of his Ponzi scheme. The fabricated user metrics and the offshore payment gateways were now the physical property of the United States Department of Justice. Chase was escorted out of his own building through the service elevator, his wrists secured in standard-issue steel. Simultaneously, the commercial creditors in Manhattan received the automated termination notice from Apex Capital Partners. The underwriters immediately recognized their high-yield mezzanine debt was resting on forged property deeds. Financial institutions do not hesitate when their capital is threatened. They initiated a comprehensive asset freeze on Horizon Holdings. Richard discovered the freeze in the most mundane, humiliating manner possible. According to the inevitable gossip filtering through the country club network, my father attempted to pay for a premium golf outing using his primary platinum card. The transaction declined. He tried a second card, and then a third. Every account tied to his name, his social security number, and his Delaware shell company was locked. The bank severed his access to the modern economy. He could not withdraw a single dollar to purchase a cup of coffee, let alone retain a high-powered defense attorney. The wealth he used to command respect and subjugate his family evaporated into a glaring red error message on a payment terminal. The foreclosure on the Lexington estate followed with ruthless efficiency. Since Richard had illegally leveraged the property to secure the fraudulent bridge loans, the creditors possessed the immediate right of receivership. The bank did not offer a grace period or a renegotiation. They issued an eviction notice. The sprawling monument to his ego, the house, where he sat behind a mahogany desk and denied me an education, was seized. My parents were forced to pack their lives into cardboard boxes while neighborhood peers watched from behind manicured hedges. The antique furniture, the imported rugs, and the crystal decanters were liquidated to satisfy a fraction of the outstanding debt. Richard and Caroline relocated to a cramped two-bedroom rental apartment in a working-class neighborhood miles away from their former kingdom. They traded sweeping staircases and catered parties for shared walls and linoleum floors. They became exiles, banished from the affluent zip code they once ruled. The sudden evaporation of their stolen wealth triggered the immediate departure of the most superficial element in their orbit. Chloe built her entire identity on the illusion of Chase's success. She required a constant influx of capital to maintain her lifestyle influencer brand. The moment the Chestnut Hill mansion entered foreclosure and her husband faced federal indictment, her loyalty vanished. She did not stand by the man she married. She packed her $15,000 Cartier watch, her designer handbags, and her luxury wardrobe into her luxury vehicle. She filed for divorce, citing irreconcilable differences, and moved out of state before the weekend concluded. She abandoned Chase to navigate his criminal charges alone, proving her affection was merely a transaction that his bank account could no longer fund. As their reality crumbled, the communication strategy directed at me underwent a seismic shift. The arrogant demands for $250,000 bank checks ceased. My personal mobile phone occasionally vibrated with notifications from an unlisted number. Caroline resorted to leaving frantic, weeping voicemails. I sat in my minimalist condominium overlooking the Boston Harbor, listening to the digital recordings of her despair. Her voice lacked the theatrical projection she utilized during her public shaming attempt at the cafe. It was a raw, desperate plea. She begged me to speak to the federal prosecutors on their behalf. She pleaded with me to use my influence as a senior director to drop the charges or smooth things over with the institutional lenders. Her voicemails revealed a staggering, fundamental ignorance of how the world actually operates. She still viewed me as the subservient daughter who could fix a broken vase or cover a missed curfew. She genuinely believed a private equity executive could simply call a federal prosecutor and ask them to ignore a multi-million-dollar wire fraud conspiracy because we shared the same last name. She thought the legal system was just another country club board that could be swayed with a polite conversation. I did not return a single call. I did not draft a text message explaining the separation of powers or the rigid nature of federal sentencing guidelines. Explanations are a currency you provide to individuals whose comprehension you value. I simply downloaded the audio files, saving them to a secure encrypted cloud drive for my own legal protection. Then I navigated to the settings menu on my device and permanently blocked the incoming numbers. I severed the final digital thread tethering me to their sinking ship. The contrast between the two siblings was now permanently etched into the public record. Richard spent $300,000 to secure his golden boy an elite business degree. He funded a life of unparalleled privilege, shielding his son from every consequence and engineering a path to effortless success. That monumental investment led Chase straight into a federal indictment, a shattered marriage, and the impending reality of a minimum security prison cell. Meanwhile, the secondary asset, the invisible daughter they discarded with a piece of plastic, dismantled their entire existence without breaking a sweat. I took the library card they handed me and devoured the rules of their own game. I learned the mechanics of corporate valuation, the rigid structure of contract law, and the unforgiving nature of institutional auditing. I used their profound underestimation as my greatest tactical advantage. They starved me of their wealth, but they fed me a relentless driving hunger to understand the architecture of power. The fallout was complete. The extortion was neutralized. My parents were drowning in the grim reality of their unearned arrogance, while I remained untouched, secure in the sanctuary I built with my own hands. But the termination of the $50 million buyout did not just punish the guilty. It created a massive operational vacuum at Apex Capital Partners. The managing partners required an executive who possessed the surgical precision to uncover such a massive liability before the firm transferred its capital. They needed someone who prioritized data over sentiment and execution over optics. The corporate arena abhors a vacuum, and the impending week would deliver the ultimate professional validation for the scapegoat who burned her own family to protect the firm. Exactly 30 days have elapsed since the dual latches of my leather briefcase snapped open in the Lexington living room. I sit behind a sprawling slate desk on the highest floor of the Apex Capital Tower. The Boston skyline stretches out beyond the reinforced glass. The winter sun casts long, sharp shadows across the financial district. The quiet humming of the central heating provides a steady rhythm to the afternoon. I am not functioning as a senior director anymore. The brass nameplate resting near my terminal bears a new title: Managing Partner. In the ruthless ecosystem of private equity, survival hinges on a singular metric: risk mitigation. The executive board reviewed the due diligence dossier I compiled on my brother. They analyzed the data trails linking the phantom revenue to the offshore payment gateways. They saw the federal referrals that shielded our institution from a catastrophic $50 million liability. The partners did not view my actions as a familial betrayal. They recognized a level of clinical detachment that cannot be taught in a corporate seminar. I audited my own bloodline and executed the termination order without a fraction of a second of hesitation. Corporate America rewards pragmatism over nepotism. The board summoned me to the primary conference room the following Monday. The senior founder slid a dense legal contract across the polished wood. It was an elevation to the highest tier of the firm. The promotion included an equity stake in the portfolio and a 7-figure signing bonus. They handed me the keys to the kingdom because I proved I would never let sentimentality compromise the ledger. I signed the contract using my grandmother's maiden name, securing my ascension with the same silver pen I use every single day. I did not funnel that signing bonus into depreciating assets. I did not purchase a $15,000 watch to broadcast my success to strangers on the internet. I acquired a sanctuary. I purchased a stunning penthouse unit in the Seaport District, paying the entire balance in cash. The residence features wraparound terraces and unobstructed views of the Atlantic Ocean. The interior is a study in minimalism. There is no clutter. There are no heavy antique furnishings reeking of suburban pretense. Every square inch of the marble floors and the vaulted ceilings was secured through my own verified labor. My new home is a fortress devoid of toxicity. The title deed sits in a secure trust registered solely to me. There are no hidden liens. There are no forged commercial guarantees buried in a Delaware shell company. I wake up every morning in a space that no one can leverage, threaten, or take away. I walk through the expansive corridors and breathe air that belongs entirely to me. The silence in this penthouse is not the heavy, paralyzed shock of a ruined dinner party. It is the tranquil, steady peace of a woman who engineered her own liberation. Meanwhile, the architects of my early misery navigate a vastly different reality. The federal indictment handed down to Chase carried multiple counts of conspiracy and wire fraud. Stripped of his leased downtown office and his tailored Italian suits, he now spends his days sitting in sterile waiting rooms, consulting with overwhelmed public defenders. The golden boy, who coasted through life on unearned capital, is learning the rigid, unforgiving schedule of the federal justice system. Richard and Caroline remain trapped in their cramped rental unit, watching the remnants of their country club empire fade into neighborhood gossip. They are ghosts, haunting the periphery of a world that exiled them. If you are listening to this narrative and you recognize the echo of your own life in these events, I need you to focus. I need you to hear the underlying truth hiding beneath the suburban mythology. We are raised in a society that fetishizes the family unit. We are conditioned from childhood to believe that shared DNA is a sacred, binding contract. We are taught that loyalty to our parents and our siblings requires infinite patience and endless sacrifice. We are told to forgive the unforgivable, simply because the transgressor sits across from us at the holiday table. That is a dangerous, manipulative myth. Biology is merely a genetic accident. It does not grant anyone the permanent right to treat you as a disposable resource. When a toxic dynamic reduces you to a human ledger, you must reevaluate the balance sheet. If your relatives view your achievements not as milestones to celebrate, but as emergency funds to raid, they are not your family. They are parasites draped in the comforting language of kinship. They will drain your bank accounts, sabotage your career, and consume your mental stability to protect their preferred narrative. You do not owe them your destruction. When the people who are supposed to protect you decide to lock you in a glass conference room and demand your life savings, you have every right to strike back. You have the right to gather the evidence, record the conversations, and compile the data. You are allowed to take the emotional manipulation they weaponize against you and turn it into a rigid, unassailable fortress. When abusers try to force you to bridge the gap of their own incompetence, you hold the right to become the architect of their ruin. Do not shrink to fit into the small, subservient box they constructed for you. Do not let the fear of public embarrassment or the threat of a smear campaign dictate your decisions. The truth does not require a raised voice or a theatrical performance in a coffee shop. It only requires illumination. You hold the currency of your own life. You dictate who is granted access to your energy, your time, and your capital. Drawing a boundary is not an act of cruelty. It is the ultimate expression of self-respect. The satisfying payoff waiting at the end of this difficult transition is the realization of absolute autonomy. The moment you sever the final cord tying you to their expectations, the entire horizon opens up. You realize that the very tactics they used to suppress your growth actually provided the foundation for your eventual triumph. My parents believed they were maintaining the hierarchy when they handed a $300,000 education to my brother and left me with nothing. They thought they were starving me by denying me their wealth. They were profoundly mistaken. By refusing to subsidize my existence, they removed their only mechanism of control. They forced me to navigate the complex machinery of the real world without a safety net. They instilled in me a relentless, driving hunger to understand how corporate power is built and how it can be dismantled. They handed me the exact tools I needed to audit their deception. A $300,000 degree can buy a superficial network. It can purchase a seat at a Mahogany dining table and fund a holotech startup for a few fleeting years. But a free public library card bought me the lethal precision to tear that entire kingdom down. I read the books. I learned the laws. I secured my own empire, and I am never giving it back. I stand looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows of my seaport penthouse, watching the dark harbor waters reflect the glowing city skyline. The journey from a discarded teenager clutching a plastic library card to the managing partner of a ruthless private equity firm delivered a brutal curriculum. Looking back at the wreckage of my parents' suburban empire and my brother's impending federal prison sentence, I want to leave you with 5 definitive lessons I learned from dismantling my own toxic lineage. First blood does not obligate you to serve as collateral damage. Society demands we set ourselves on fire simply to keep our relatives warm. You possess the fundamental right to hand them a fire extinguisher and walk away. Biology is a genetic accident, while mutual respect is a required baseline for any relationship. Second, pure competence is the ultimate equalizer. Inherited privilege and $300,000 degrees can purchase temporary access, but they cannot buy genuine survival skills. The raw knowledge you acquire in the shadows, while everyone else is coasting on their last name, will always outmaneuver unearned confidence in the boardroom. Third, silence and timing are exponentially more lethal than shouting. When an abuser attempts to provoke a public reaction or corners you in a glass room, do not raise your voice. Gather your evidence, secure your financial assets, and let the institutional machinery do the screaming for you. A meticulously timed federal compliance report speaks louder than any argument at a Mahogany dining table. Fourth, narcissists will always hand you the rope to hang them if you simply let them talk. My sister-in-law confessed to a coordinated property forgery just because she wanted to brag about her newly purchased designer watch. Keep your receipts, document the threats, and let their own unchecked arrogance build the cage that eventually traps them. Fifth and finally, true autonomy begins the exact moment you stop seeking the approval of individuals who inherently devalue you. My parents dangled their conditional affection over my head, assuming I would eventually crawl back to secure a seat at their elite gatherings. The second I realized I could build my own table, their leverage evaporated into nothing. You hold the pen to your own life. Do not let anyone forge your signature on a narrative you did not write. If my journey from the quiet aisles of the Boston Public Library to the top floor of the financial district resonated with your own experiences, Please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to Maya Tells Stories. Drop a comment below and tell me about the specific moment you finally drew an unbreakable boundary with a toxic person in your orbit. I read every single response. Protect your peace, guard your ledger, and never apologize for engineering your own freedom.